All right, why don't we launch into the meat of our presentation here on Zeiss Form Review in Retina Workplace. The presentation is entitled Putting It All Together because hopefully, as you'll be able to see during the course of the talk, this is exactly what a high quality image review platform can do for your practice, at least in terms of retinal imaging. This talk is part of a larger virtual user meeting that Zeiss has been gracious enough to put on over the past several weeks. And hopefully, as part of that experience, you've been able to learn a little bit more about some of the innovative and powerful imaging devices from Zeiss, including the Cirrus 6000 and the Claris 5 and 700. Certainly, these devices provide a lot of opportunities to use this multimodal functionality to explore different aspects of retinal disease, which I think can really help boost the diagnostic utility of your retinal imaging. That's a great aspect of these devices, but one of the downsides is it does end up generating a lot of usable images. Whether it's a 12 millimeter HD one-line scan or a 12 by 12 millimeter OCTA study on the Cirrus, or a wide field ICG or fluorescein angiogram on the Claris 700, you end up having to spend a lot of time working through all these images that you've obtained. This can lead to a problem that I've coined image overload. What image overload is a problem that stems from several root causes. I think number one, we're all getting more frequent imaging. Many of our patients see us frequently, even monthly, and receive a retinal image at every visit. Obviously, as we discussed on the previous slide, there's a greater diversity of imaging modalities available to us today, and I think we're all seeing increasingly larger patient volumes. This can lead to one of two problems. Number one, either we engage in these prolonged and inefficient patient encounters in which we spend a large amount of time reviewing images, clicking between different softwares, and typically having our backs to the patient. This is obviously not an efficient way to run a clinical practice. The second alternative is that we engage instead in inadequate image review, in which providers fail to maximize the diagnostic value of the imaging that they've obtained. I think they're both lead to a poorer quality clinical care. I think regarding the prolonged and inefficient patient encounters, I think that's particularly worrisome during the COVID-19 era, in which I think high patient throughput and a lower density of patients in clinic is particularly important to help curb the spread of the virus. So I think the challenge for the modern day retina provider then becomes, how do we sensibly analyze our imaging data while still efficiently utilizing our clinic time and still trying to maintain a patient-focused and interactive manner? There have been several solutions to this problem that have been proposed in the past. I think the most traditional approach is to use these paper printouts for each imaging study that's obtained. Manual printing is certainly a slow and tedious process, can be quite expensive due to the consumption of lots of printer ink. And when you review these images, they're quite small and lower resolution, so I think you don't capture the full impact of some of these images. Also, you're unable to interact with these images, right? You can't scroll through an OCT, you can't zoom in on a fundus image or change the contrast or brightness, etc. So there's a lot of limitations there and leads to a lot of inefficiency. A slightly more updated approach is to use multiple applications on a review workstation. This is sort of the approach we used in our practice several years ago. And so essentially under this technique, you're basically using a different app for each device in which you obtain an image for that patient. So you end up pulling up a lot of different apps, having to log into each app and enter the patient info into each app. And it's a lot of redundancy, a lot of wasted keystrokes. Obviously, the upside, as opposed to paper printouts, is that you are able to interact with the images. They typically are of larger size. They're nice, large digital images on a computer monitor. So some benefits over printouts, but certainly still a limited way to review images. So at this point, I think really the gold standard for image review at this point is using a PACS system, which is really a comprehensive image review solution in which all the patient's images from all devices are stored in a single location and are reviewable and able to be interacted with within a certain software solution. In terms of PACS systems, I think the Zeiss integrated diagnostic imaging platform is certainly the foremost retina PACS on the market today, and that's what we'll be digging into further during the talk. The Zeiss IDI consists of two key components. There's the backbone, which is the form review software, which is basically your ophthalmic PACS, a fully featured image review system, and it has a add-on, the Retina Workplace, which is an advanced retinal analytics software. This is how the Zeiss IDI system infrastructure is set up in our practice. We obviously have many OCT and OCTA devices, as well as a plethora of fundus imaging devices. And these, I should note, are both Zeiss and non-Zeiss devices, although we predominantly have Zeiss devices. And these devices all capture images and create DICOM files, which then are transferred to our Forum server, which is our sort of single repository of our retinal images and helps manage all of our imaging data. The Forum server then communicates with all of our offices. You know, we have a large practice in Middle Tennessee. We have a main office in Nashville with about 8 satellites scattered throughout Middle Tennessee. And within each of these offices, there are multiple lanes. In each lane, there's a review workstation running a Forum review and Retina Workplace. And that software communicates with this Forum server to allow us to review a patient's images, interact with them, annotate them, etc. You know, this is sort of a decision that we made as a practice many years ago, that we really value the ability to have access to a patient's entire imaging history at any office at any time. And so what does that mean? Well, let's say, for example, we have a patient who's typically seen at, say, Satellite 1. They go there monthly and get lots of images, and they call us one Saturday with a new urgent problem and are asked to come see us at our main office for a triage visit. And so when they come to our main office, we still have access to all those images from Satellite 1 and can compare the current day's images to the prior day's images. And we find that really lends itself to higher quality care, and it's something that we really value. Obviously, the specific structure for this setup can vary depending on practice needs and size, right? You could have a single workstation running a single iteration of a Forum review for a small single office practice. You could set up individual Forum servers at a couple of regional satellite offices just to review images in that site, or you could have this very large structure like we have, where we have this regional infrastructure to feed all of our satellite offices. Again, a very scalable application. So how does Forum Review work in practice? Well, the initial screen that you'll encounter is this screen right here, and it's the patient directory, which acts initially as a database that's linked to your central server. With your standard search bar here, you can identify a patient by name or ID number. There's also advanced search options, which we can look at a little bit later. But basically, you would select a patient, you can double click, and this will bring you to the patient record, which is the screen we see here. This contains the patient's entire imaging history. Each of these rectangular boxes represents all the images obtained at a single visit. You see the date right here, and each thumbnail represents a different image, a modality, or a different repeat, I guess, image from that same modality. On the right, we have our visit history containing a selectable list of visits. This is basically the entirety of the patient's history of visits at our office. You'll notice are these columns here, and these represent different imaging types, sort of grouped into broad categories. And so this is a good way to quickly identify, say, the last time the patient had a fundus photograph, right? You see there's one here on August 15th of 2018. You could scroll down, and the next pink dot represent the most recent prior fundus image. So again, a nice and quick way to identify, say, a similar image. You can also click on these headings and bring up only the visits that have that type of imaging done on that day. If you double click on one of these images, it brings you to this interactive image review page where a study can be reviewed, adjusted, annotated, etc. as needed. You'll see here we pulled up a 5-line raster scan, which shows your cross-sectional B scan here in the large pane, and then on the smaller pane to the right, you have your en-face fundus image demonstrating the location of the B scan that you're evaluating. You can switch these by double-clicking on the fundus image on the upper right and bring that to the larger pane. So again, just a pretty standard way to review images. I want to note that this interactive review can be done with both Zeiss and non-Zeiss devices. So I think that's a feature that's relatively unique to Forum. It's somewhat device manufacturer agnostic. You don't have to only use Zeiss devices, and I think that really speaks to Zeiss's efforts to make this a all-in-one solution, so you don't have to have all these different softwares running in your practice. This is another way to review images in an interactive manner. We're looking at the fundus image review. We see here a patient who has geographic atrophy, which is sort of progressive over time. And I wanted to show this image because it kind of highlights how easy it is to do these comparative arrays. If you think back to our patient record page, you have those little thumbnails. If you highlight, say, 3 thumbnails from different visits, you can right click and hit document display, and it brings in automatically this sort of comparative array. In this case, it's a 3x1, but you can change that up. It can also sort of automatically choose the kind of the best size. If you chose, say, 4, it'd be a 2x2, et cetera. But again, a nice way to review fundus images in a longitudinal fashion. But this, I think, is really where the Zeiss IDI system shines. It's this Retina Workplace feature, which is an advanced retinal analytics software package. This really allows you to dig more deeply into sort of macroscopic trends in a patient's OCT data over time. There are several powerful analyses that are available. There's this first one, which is the macular thickness analysis, which looks at different OCT thickness metrics over time, right? Things like central subfield thickness or cube volume. There's also the advanced RPE analysis, which looks at RPE density, or basically geographic atrophy development over time. And then there's the angiography analysis. And this is, I should note, in the newest version of Retina Workplace, which is still pending FDA approval, that's where this feature will be available. There's a sort of a skeletonized version of it currently in the current version of Retina Workplace, when you can look at the on-FOS images over time and sort of interact with them, but it's missing this sort of longitudinal aspect where you can look at all the data over time. So, but what the plan is, and I've had the opportunity to use this, is look at specific angiometrics, so things like FAZ size or vessel density, et cetera, over time. I think this is really going to change how we use OCT. I think one of the big limitations that we've encountered so far with OCT angiography is that it sort of lacks the quantitative data that we're used to using with macular thickness metrics like central subfield thickness. So once we get quantitative data, particularly comparative quantitative data, I think that's going to help us really unlock some information that we've been missing by just staring at these on-FOS images. And so I would look out for that in the near future. So this is what the standard Retina Workplace screen looks like. You get this sort of 3-up OCT comparison, which I think, again, is unique to this system. So most OCT review softwares that I've used have basically 2 panes, which is one for the current visit and one for the prior visit. And in this case, Zeiss has added a 3rd pane to pull up a 3rd OCT to be reviewed. Again, this is in point-to-point registered fashion, right? So as you scroll through these images, they all scroll together. So you're really comparing each slice to the prior visits slices. Again, two separate visits in the past. This is nice because you can use the sort of standard current and previous visit and also have a 3rd box to look at, say, the patient's first visit or maybe their last recurrence for patients undergoing anti-VEGF therapy. Why is that helpful? Well, a couple of reasons. One, I oftentimes like to pull up the first visit because patients may, as in this case, see a pretty modest improvement or almost no change between the previous and current visit. But when you're able to show the patients or educate them that this is where you came from, you can really help encourage them that indeed we are making progress. Not every visit shows a tremendous jump, but just show them where they came from. Also, I like the ability to look at the last recurrence to see that, to make sure that we're not sort of trending in that direction and maybe adjust therapy as needed. On the bottom here, we have this longitudinal sort of line graph analysis. And what we're looking at here in orange is the central subfield thickness. And in green, we have our average cube thickness. And this is plotted over time. And each dot here represents a different visit, right? So we're not just looking at the 3 visits that we have in the OCT comparison above. We're actually looking at all the patient's visits, again, over time. You have the dates down here on the bottom. And what's nice about this is you can actually click and drag one of these visits up, and it'll actually pull up the cross-sectional image as well as a thickness map in that box. So again, very easy to quickly look back. And as you can see, you can actually note little changes in the patient's status, right? So here was a little blip where they had an increased CST, so maybe a little recurrence here. Again, it's an easy way to go back and say, well, how did they look when they had their last recurrence and what was the time frame at which they had that recurrence? So a nice way to help manage our patients over time. So at this point, it'd be nice to move on to some cases and actually pull up the software and really show you how it works. With this sort of live tutorial, hopefully you'll be able to get a feel for exactly how Form and Retina Workplace can work to enhance your imaging process. I think before moving on, though, I do want to highlight sort of 2 different ways in which I'll be using the software to kind of maximize what we're able to obtain from our imaging. You'll see these during the tutorial, but I want to highlight them ahead of time so you know exactly what I'm talking about when I refer to these terms. And the first thing I do a lot with the software is I use these multimodal overlays, as we see on the left. And what this is basically all the patient's images sort of stacked on top of each other, right? So we're able to correlate locations and correlate different imaging modalities as well as cross-sectional imaging all on a single screen, right? It's very easy to navigate between these different imaging types with just a few clicks. I think this is very helpful for correlating and assessing findings across different modalities, which is a key for diagnosis. So I use this frequently in new patients or patients with new problems or unknowns. And the other aspect we just kind of touched on the previous slide, which is these longitudinal analyses, which is where Retina Workplace really comes in. And this helps us sort of monitor change over time. I think this is very helpful for disease management, particularly as relates to patients undergoing anti-VEGF therapy. So again, look out for these in the live tutorial because we'll be kind of talking about this quite a bit. So why don't we go ahead and move on to our cases next.